we're going to talk about really 4 different kind of things at a high level. One, I'm going to talk about how you get an Excel sheet attached to to your Stratum information, in particular the Stratum cube. And then I'm going to show you how you can use that with some pivots, both a pivot table and a pivot chart. Just show a little bit of that. We've shown a lot of this before. We've done some other sessions on this. So I wasn't going to spend a lot of time here. There's a couple of things as Excel has advanced and probably I've become a little more competent at using Excel attached to Stratum. I'll show a couple of tricks and tips and tricks there. And then I'm going to use some of what are called the cube functions in a normal Excel sheet and just kind of show you how you might take advantage of that. And I like this feature because number one, this was pointed out to me by a customer, thanks to the folks over at Brasscraft, Pat Franklin over there. But those guys are using it. Some of their accounting folks were using this. So it's an interesting way to blend information from the Stratum cube with a normal Excel sheet, not a pivot, but so you can enter information, do some things there. So that's kind of interesting. And then the last thing I'll talk about is actually an upcoming new feature that'll be in a release later this year. I assume that release will probably be called 6.9, but it's actually for exporting data, and I'll talk a little bit more into Excel, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So let's see. Amazingly enough, to get started, I think I'll go into Excel and show you guys a couple things. So one of the first things I want to talk about is if you look at this particular chart here, this Excel sheet, anything in green is coming, in this light green, is coming directly from the Stratum cube. So there's a connection under the covers back into the cube, so every day this data would be updated. Or if I go back to my regional sales example here, all of this data is coming directly out of the cube. So that's interesting, or I hope that's interesting, and that's why you're here. But what I will do is I will go ahead and let's set up just a new pivot attached to a cube at here in my demo. So I'll just start with a blank sheet and show you how I'm going to do that. So you're going to need to know a couple of things. So the first thing, when I go to data, you can see here I've got some existing connections. So the good news is once you set up one of these connections, you can reuse it. I've got one, amazingly enough, called Stratum right here that I could use, and that would just go get me all the data in Stratum automatically. But for the purposes of today's example, let's start fresh. I'm going to say get data. I'm going to say let's get it from a database. And I'm actually going to say from analysis services. What you don't want to use is this data import. There are cases that you might want to use that, but normally you would want to use from analysis services. So when I click analysis services, this is going to ask me a couple of things. I'm going to need to know the server name. I'm going to need to know the name of the database, and I'm going to need to know the cube name. Those are all things that are very easily obtained, and I'll show you how to do that. While I'm flipping over here, one of the things that you should be aware of, if you're not on version 6.8 and you are a security administrator in Stratum, you might have trouble getting into the cube via Excel. That problem has been fixed in 6.8, but that's a very small number of people, as most people are not security administrators in Stratum. And for those of you that are interested in that, that has to do with how roles are treated up on the server and their integration with analysis services. We don't have to get into the details there, but let's see. I went into Stratum and ran a view is what I did here. That's the first thing, and we're trying to find out that server name, the database name, and the cube name. So I ran a view, and then what I'm going to do in the view is just open the View Explorer, and I'm going to double-click or look for the properties of the view. So it's the very first node at the very top. If I double-click on that, what you'll see is down here at the bottom, there's 3 fields. One's called the server, one's called the database, and the other's called the cube. And you're going to need to know those 3 things to finish up back on that connection I was showing in Excel. So I happen to know these for my Excel, so I'm going to go, or for my Excel attachment, so I'm going to go back over here, and my server name is Sylvan Demo 2, I'm just going to say next. I always use Windows Authentication. Next, you probably, when you guys go through this, probably will not have a ton of stuff listed here. It would be unusual for you to actually have more than one. I, of course, am on a demo server, and I've got approximately 1 million on here. But I'm going to select that database that was over, that came from right down here. So that's the name of the cube or the database that we're using. And then in general, you'll only have one cube that you need to select here. If you're using all the standard Stratum stuff, this will always be an all data cube and you'll be fine. Then I just say next. I can give this a name. This is my Insight example, for example. And then I just finish. And what that's going to say is, how do you want this data delivered? I'm going to use a pivot table report, but you could do a chart. You could say only create the connection, and then the sheet will let you use the connection for some of the cube functions I've been talking about. So I'm just going to use I'm just going to create a simple pivot table real quick, and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to say OK. And what that's done is, right now it's connecting to the cube, and you can see over here what's in this list of stuff. As I scroll through it, there's 1 million things here, but these are all of my dimensions, all of my measures that came right out of Stratum. And what I'm going to do, I've already got an example set up instead of picking all these just out of here. But now you could just begin to build a pivot right out of this, just like you would normally. And I'm going to go over to my example over here. I have a regional sales pivot that I've put together. Just to kind of show you, this is using connection identical to the one we just looked at. And I can do some different things here. If I look at this pivot, this is showing me year-to-date information. Information by month going across here. I've got some slicers set up for the region and the product category. I'm looking at customers right now. And I've got this year's sales and last year's sales, and then a percentage between those two. And this is actually, so this is demo data, so you'll note that my year-over-year sales is rather consistent. But you can see there are places where this is turned red. It turns different colors. I'm using some of the conditional formatting in Excel on top of this stuff. Here's one where it's yellow over here. So, but this is very easily obtained. And a couple of things here as I look at this. So what would I want to do while I'm here? Well, the obvious thing, maybe I want to look at a different region, so I can click on the region, and that just went out to Stratum and changed the data automatically. I could pick additional categories. I'm holding the control key down right now, so that added some categories to the data. So I have those choices, but then I might want to add new data into what I'm looking at here. So I'm just going to bring up the field list and select from that. So this is normal pivot table stuff. Let's say I wanted to add returns data to this. So I'm going to add returns. Got to spell it right. So there we go. I'll add returns amount. I'm just going to drag that down into what's shown here. And you'll see that inserted the returns amount here. And then I can begin to format this just like you would normally in Excel. I can add different things. I can use it, I can make it $1. I can do all the formatting that you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with in Excel. So that's one thing that I can do here. And that makes that pretty easy. Another thing is I could bring in dimensions. Let's say I want to bring in the brand here. So I want to have some brand information. So you'll see it found product brand for me. I'm going to drag the brand down and drop it in here. I actually wanted that the other way, so I'll just drag brand up here. So now I've got brands first. Now note that there's no description here. I can just right click here. I can go ahead and show these properties in the report. So I'll load that up. So that'll show me that. And I have options here. I've got the totals on top. You can adjust all that stuff by looking at the field settings for product brand. So you can begin to decide where you want things, things like that. And these are all normal pivot table things. So that's going out to Stratum and bringing that data in. And, of course, anytime that the data in Stratum gets updated, this sheet, when you open it, is going to update. So you have those options on the dimensions. A couple of things, if you do this, that I think are kind of interesting. So if you were to look at this, maybe make this a little bit easier to look at. I'm going to go ahead and remove those returns that I added just as an example. But so I've got 2 columns of data here that you can see for each month. And one of the things that, so I'm looking at current year. So I selected the dimension current year for the top axes there. and I drilled down into the months. So this particular number, this year's sales, is just the sales amount that I have for that year. But to get last year's sales to display, since I'm looking at current year, you have to use a little trick here, and it's very similar for those of you that are familiar in Stratum with creating what we call tuples. You have that option. It's very simple to do, where you want to say, hey, I want to see that the sales amount, but I want that to always be last year instead of this year. So to do that in a pivot, you have to come up here in this Analyze and Design, and there's some OLAP. When we talk about our database, it's an OLAP database. So you can drop this down, and you can see here I've got some calculated measures. You can add one. I can manage them. I'll just show you the existing one. So here's that last year's sales. If I go ahead and just show you what that looks like. What you can see here is I basically, you can pick these off by going to create these in Stratum and just copy it over, because in Stratum in our wizard, we would let you just select this stuff. You'd go in and select last year, and then you'd put a comma, and you'd select actual sales amount. So what that's doing is saying, instead of using this current year up here to filter what I'm looking at, it's going to go ahead and use this, which is described here as last year, and show me actual sales amount. So what that allows me to do now, obviously, is show this year versus last year, and then I'm just using a regular calculation to go ahead and create the percentage there in between them. So that's just something as you begin to use this technique for a pivot. That's one of the things that you'll want to get used to, is inserting some of these calculations. And again, this calculation, if you were to look at what's called a tuple in Stratum in Viewer, there's an option to create tuples, and it's this exact same thing. There's some really great examples of this stuff in the help. If you look up MDX in the help, which these are called, as you can see at the top of the screen here, MDX calculations, there's some great examples of different tuples and things you can create to create examples like this. So now that I'm in Excel and I have this data, of course, I can plug in any dimensions I want. I can add slicers. You can see if I wanted additional slicers, there's an add slicer piece in here. So there's a lot of things you can do if you're a pivot table wizard. We're going to rapidly get beyond my particular capabilities in pivot tables, because I'm not that great with them, and I was able to get this far. So I think this shows you can do that. Another example of this might be where you, instead of when I created that connection, I said create a pivot table. So it'd be more of a look like this. You could also say create a pivot table chart, and I have one of those floating around here. So here I've just created, again, if I click here, I'll get the field list up again. It's that same field list we were looking at. I'm sharing that Stratum connection, and I've just got all my stuff from Stratum embedded in here. But as I'm in here now, I've added some slicers around this. My point here is you can use the graphing functions in Excel directly attached to Stratum, so all these charts would update as you go. Here I'm looking at this. Maybe I want to change this to last year. Maybe I only want a few months out of last year, so I can select the months that I want, whatever it might be. So when I do that, obviously the pie chart changed, and now I'm looking at different stuff. I can select different salespeople, get rid of some people here. I don't know, just arbitrarily doing some. But, again, it's going to allow you to use the graphing functions in Excel and what they look like. Here, I've got a pie chart going. I can select all the different pie chart, features that are in Excel. I can go through and use different ones. I don't know. I'll just select some. There we go. So you have a lot of choices in how you might use this and how you attach, and all the different things you can do from a pivot standpoint. So that's kind of a look at just pivot tables and pivot charts attached directly to the cube. And you can do all the pivot table type things you want to do. The other thing that I wanted to show was, I wanted to show using in a normal Excel sheet, so not a pivot, the ability to pull in information out of Stratum and intermix that with other data that you might have just in Excel or that you've keyed in. So I apologize for some of the colors here, but this was to help you guys be able to understand what some of this stuff is, and probably help me remember But basically, I have just a basic Excel sheet here, and I've pulled in a couple of things. So first of all the stuff in this off yellow here is just text I've keyed in or whatever for headers and stuff like that. Anything in this off red down here, this light red, is actually data that I'm going to key in, and something's going to happen when I change that data. And I'll talk some more about that in a minute. The data in green is actually being retrieved from Stratum every time I open this sheet. So I'll talk some more about that in a minute and how I did those things so you can see that. And then last is I've just got some normal Excel calculations, nothing fancy. These are just sums down at the bottom. This adjusted budget is actually a calc using the budget for next month. As all of you have probably heard me say, by the way, in my demo, it's always September. So imagine if the current month is September, I wouldn't have any sales for the next month, but I pulled in the budget in that case. Then I'm allowing us to adjust the budget. I'll show some of this. So working our way across here, I've got divisions. So I just have my divisions and I have them listed here, and I'm pulling in the information to get the descriptions for that. So you can see here up at the top that I'm using what's called the cube member property, and I can take that, and that particular formula looks something like this. Maybe not. My bad. Okay. Anyways, that formula looks something like this. So up here at the top, you can see that. So what that allows me to do when it says cube member property, the first part of this is the cube feature. So the two cube and there's a number of these if you look in the functions under cube, but the two that I found most useful are cube member property, which allows me to get information about a dimension. So in this case, I'm looking at divisions, and I could get any description, pickup field, or attribute that you might have, and I can get those values into Stratum, into your spreadsheet. So that allows you to, as you have information over there, enter in a valid dimension code, and it'll pull that in, or if it was a valid, if you're looking at sales guys, products, whatever it may be, you can pull in all that information associated with that particular piece. So to use these functions, what you basically do is you have to have a connection. So if you remember, I had a connection called Stratum, and I just entered in Stratum, and this helps point it at the cube. Then the member expression. So the first thing you have to do is go ahead and use tell it what dimension you're looking at. And you can get this, again, right out of Stratum. So if you're looking for the member expression, one of the easiest ways to do that is if I go back into Stratum. What I'll do is I'm just going to go into, I'm going to open another view that has a bunch of stuff in it. Happens to already have division in it, but a couple of things here I could do. If I'm looking for, I find the easiest way to find all the naming conventions that are used in the style database we use to reference them there is to actually just insert a calculated measure. And what that does over on the left here allows me to have all the different things here. So if I'm trying to understand, in this case, back in Excel, it's asking me what's the member expression. So it wants to know, how would it know which member I'm looking at? I could come in here and I could say, hey, division, pick a member. I'm just going to go to member list, and I'm just going to pick one of them here. I'll pick F and just say, okay. What that's going to do, you can see right here, it's substituted in the look that I need to have back in Excel. So I've got division, and then all of this stuff with the ampersand, et cetera, is actually allowing me to use the text in Excel. It's allowing me to use this text, or I'm the information in this cell as a substitution instead of just keying in the F directly, which you could do and it would work fine if you just wanted to hard code it to be F. What I liked about this was it's looking at this particular cell that I'm looking at here, A7, and it's taking whatever's there and pulling in a description, because then obviously I can copy that down for however many rows of data I have, and it'll just repeat and it'll always pull it in. And then the last thing is you have to specify a property here. So this property is, again, pretty easily obtained back in Stratum. I'm just going to pop back into Stratum, and instead of looking at this, I'm just going to block that out. I'm going to go to attribute relationships, and if I wanted the long description, I click on the long description, and amazingly enough, this is the piece right here that you would need. So the property is the division long description, and you can see all I did was substitute that right here. So what that tells me is, based on what's in this cell, and by the way, these examples, which I know they're probably a little hard to see in, here in the, because of the size of the screen, I'm going to post these examples out on our forum, so you can get to the forum a bunch of different ways, and I'll show you how to do that. But you can see here I'm just using the long description. So in the end of the day, what does that get to me? So what that allows me to do, if I went over here and I keyed in a invalid division, I don't know, I don't think I have a division T, and pressed enter, it's off getting data, and that's going to fail, and it tells me it's not available. If I keyed in a valid, I actually have a division question mark, but there's not going to be any data for that, but you'll see it didn't fail. It found the question mark, but I just don't have any data for that. Or if I keyed in an F, amazingly enough, now it's going to go out and get that data, and it found the food service. And I could, if I keyed in an F here, they'd both be food service, and I can put the G up here. So what that's doing is, based on what I have in this column, a number of things are happening. It's getting that description. That was using the cube member property. The other thing that I have here is obviously these amounts. So what I've done here is I'm using another cube function called cube value. And what that's going to do is go out and get information from the cube for a very specific measure. And again, this can be a tuple. And that's important, that the concept of a tuple, because you want to probably associate some kind of time with it. And a tuple is basically, as I described before, where you can filter the data that you're getting. So you have to specify some kind of filter. Very often it's time. In this case, obviously, I'm using the previous month, which in this case is August. But it could be other dimensions as well, but usually it's time and then a measure. So what you can see here is that I've got the cube value. Again, I've inserted my connection is Stratum. It's always the first part of any of these cube functions. And then here's the tuple. And again, I've created that tuple. And I'll go create this tuple actually in Stratum. The thing to note here is I'm using previous month. You can see that right here. So I'm using a time out of my time dimension. I'm using that kind of stuff. And then here's that what I talked about as this little ampersands and the quotes and everything allow me to reference this cell over here to grab the data. So it's saying, hey, use what's here so that I get the stuff for G. And then this last part is the measure in Stratum. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of show you how you could build the tuple that you would substitute in here, and then you could go back and put in this block of stuff that Excel requires to reference a cell. So I'm just going to, again, pop over to Stratum. Now, if you want to do a tuple using time, which I think when you're using these Excel cube functions, you probably will, you're going to want a view that has uses time as a dimension and not time ranges. So I'm just going to open a different view here where I have sales analysis report. So here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and just insert, again, I'm just going to insert a calculated measure. And you can see here in functions, you can use a tuple. A tuple is very simple. I can either insert a tuple by clicking on that, or these are very simple. I just generally enter a parentheses right there, and then you got to have a hierarchy. So what do you want to filter this by? Now, what I wanted to do here was filter this by, I'm going to use my year-based. I actually want month-based. I'm going to go to a specific member. I'm just going to say okay. So I really wanted previous month this year. So let's see, it's always September, so I'm going to pick August. By the way, this is what's displayed in this window in Stratum is being driven by what I have displayed in my view. I can actually here on the more add additional fields in here. Probably this first one makes these easier to look at if I say okay. You'll see here now it actually has the months based column here, which allows me to say, hey, what I was looking for was previous month, and that's clearly labeled right here. So I'm going to say okay. That substituted that into my tuple. So you can see up here I've got all of that. I can probably make this a little bigger. So I've got all of that, and then the last thing is I got to pick a measure, which what stuff do I want to see, and I'm going to say, hey, I wanted to see sales amounts, so I'm just going to insert that. So what this would allow me to do is I could take this tuple and I could cut and paste it right over into Excel, and that would work for me. So that's an easy way to go ahead and do that, and you can see it over here where I've got my measures. I don't really want the actual. By the way, I don't need this data 4 thing here. That's a Stratum specific thing. I just took that out, but you can see it here, and it got included here. So now I have that, and I went and changed what I pasted to use this format to grab this cell again, so I can reference a cell to bring in the amount. So once you've done that, now I have that, and obviously once I've done it once, I can just copy it around, and that would get me. You can see here if I bounce over to the next cell, which is last year. If I click on the function, you can see the difference in the two was right here. I used last year instead of current year, and that got me for the previous month. And as I move across here, here I have stuff for the this year, current month, and as you go across. So anything in green here, I'm pulling. So this is kind of interesting up here, where again, I've used the cube member property, and what I've done is I've pulled in the property for current year, previous month, last year, previous month, and then this year, current month. So as we move through time, my headers will change automatically in Excel as well. So that allows me to do that. So I don't think these calculations at the bottom need any these are just regular Excel sums. I've just summed those columns. I did add this feature down here where I can now key in information here. So if my objective here is to understand how much I'll have to change over what the budget is for next month, because I'm looking here what we did last year and 1 month out. Oops, that's over here. And here's the budget for next month, and right now, if I compare that to last year, I'd have to have a pretty significant increase. So anyways, I can do that stuff, and these are all, this is just regular Excel stuff. I inserted a percentage column here, and this allows me to key stuff in, and it calculates this column over here. So, I just wanted to show this as an example of how you can go and use a regular Excel sheet that you might have set up, but where you're consistently copying, pasting data from Stratum, you might be able to use this technique to automatically drag in the information from Stratum, so it populates every time you open and gets the current data instead of having to have a separate data sheet that you cut and paste into or whatever it may be. So anyways, that's my examples on Excel, and I think those are pretty handy if you really like to use Excel, which I know a lot of people do, or there's things you don't have in Stratum, which of course we would say, why don't you have it in Stratum? But that said, I think this allows you to. It's another way. It fits what we call our flexible information delivery strategy of, hey, if you need to get information from Stratum that's vetted and you trust on a repetitive nature into an Excel sheet, this is another technique that you can use beyond the pivots that I showed as well. So one last thing I wanted to show today before I open the phones for maybe some questions was actually something we're doing in the next version that we release, not 6.8, which you guys may have heard about. Currently, it's going under the guise of 6.9. So let me get my required stipulations out here first. This is a development version, so if something doesn't work, don't be surprised. Secondly, if it doesn't work as intended, don't be surprised. This is the first cut of the development code, but I just kind of wanted to show you guys what our objective in a new export feature for Excel was to allow you to decide for this particular view, you're exporting Excel data versus an Excel report. And the differentiation we're making there is a report is formatted, looks basically what you see is what you get. So you're going to get exactly what you have in Stratum, in a Stratum view, exported to Excel. So that's what you can do today. You guys are all familiar with this. You know, if you click the Excel button, it's just going to go ahead and it's going to export to Excel exactly what you have right here. So that's what we do today. The new feature that we're adding, what has happened technically, and I won't spend a lot of time on the technical part, is we have access to a new way to push information out to Excel. It does have some limitations, but it's much, much faster than the techniques that we use today. And the reason to do that is we find that there's customers that want to export really large amounts of data. This view obviously doesn't qualify, but it'll do for our example here. But and that takes some time in Stratum. And what we want to do is, and we're constantly looking for ways to improve performance and things like that. So we've found a technique that we think will work for people that are exporting sheets. So to use the new export Excel data, the way it's set up, you'd be able to come in and say, hey, for this view, there's an export type, and you can have a report, which I described, has all the formatting, or you can say data. And the reason it's here instead of on the Excel button is our assumption is you'll create a view that you're going to do this in a repetitive fashion, so every day, every month, every week, whatever it is, or maybe you're going to run it in the broadcast server to export to Excel through an action. So you want to have some way to save an attribute of this view. So if I save this, and I don't want to do that because other people are using it, but it would always export the same way, whether it's a report or data. But once I've changed that, then amazingly enough, I click the Excel button, and that's going to export some data for me, and I'll bring that up. And this is going to look distinctly different than what you're used to. Note that the view here doesn't have repeating rows. It does have totals turned on. If I open this Excel sheet, what I'm going to see is that it automatically repeated the data in every row. It took out the subtotals, so subtotals aren't something you can do, and it also does not format the data. So this data is just the raw data coming out of Stratum, and but now you could use this in Excel if you were building, data sheets, et cetera. It still has the view detail, tells me how that came out. But what is interesting about this, so why, at the end of the day, why do this? And is the performance that much different? And what I wanted to show you guys was just some testing we've done, some preliminary testing. Again, all of this is about, this was a prototype. Your mileage may vary. And all of the things that I need to say to make sure you guys understand we're early in testing, but the dotted line here is roughly the time that it took to export these row counts out of us on a small set of data we have here at Stratum. We're Sylvan today, our product Stratum. And you can see that the blue line that runs along the bottom, which kind of it went very fast for exporting up to, say roughly 500,000 rows. So I think we really, if we get anything close to what's listed on this chart, which was some preliminary testing we did, I think you'll find in this release you'll have a really great way to export data much more quickly than you can today. So that was the last thing I was going to show today.